So what are you thinking? Are you a monist or a dualist? Where do you seem to be coming down on these questions? Are you starting to side more with the idea that physical things are the only kinds of things that have ever existed, the only kinds of things that can exist in reality? Or have you opened that door to the possibility that maybe some non-material things do exist or could exist? I can conceive of non-material things that are actually a feature of reality. One of the questions I gave you in your thought primer might point you towards how you're coming down on these questions. I asked you, is this statement true or false? And the statement is, if something exists in reality, then that thing will be observable or measurable in some way. That is, the thing can be seen, smelled, tasted, touched, or felt. Now, remember, just because we haven't yet discovered something exists doesn't necessarily mean that that thing is non-material or non-physical. We might just not have developed yet the technology to make our observations. Think about all that we know now about infrared, and think about all we've learned from microscopes and telescopes that people were before completely oblivious to. But just because they hadn't yet perceived them with their physical senses didn't mean that they were non-physical things. They just didn't have the ability to know what was there. All right, so if you said that this is a true statement, that's pretty solid position, monist position, that only physical things exist. But again, if you crack that door open to maybe some non-physical things exist, you probably would have said false to this statement. Now, of course, if you said false, that this statement is false, you'd have to come up with an example. Give me one thing that you think you have reason to believe actually exists in reality that can't be perceived by our five senses. Maybe you come up with something like, well, the multiplication tables. I think the multiplication tables exist in reality, even though they're not perceptible with my five senses. The multiplication tables don't have a particular smell or taste. I can't hold them in my hand. I can hold representations of them in my hand, and I can see representations of them with my eyes. But the multiplication tables, they're a concept. And maybe we come to the conclusion that that concept is not necessarily a human construction. The concept of multiplication table seems to be a feature of reality. It's kind of baked into the system. In other words, we might think about this. What if every thinking thing ceased to exist? And so there was nothing to think about the multiplication tables. If at some point in the very distant future, there came to exist again some kind of thinking thing, could that thinking thing discover the multiplication tables? Are they quote unquote out there? Are they in reality in some way that would allow a thinking thing to rediscover what was lost with the extinction of all of the thinking things before? Or is it just a construction, a particular idiosyncratic construction of human beings and their minds, and the multiplication tables, while useful, they're not actually real? Okay, so maybe that's a way to think about this question. What about the multiplication tables? Do they exist in reality, or are they just made up? We're headed quickly towards this problem, this metaphysical problem called the mind-body problem, and it's a difficult one. It starts with this. I'm going to give you 4 statements, but you can only believe 3 of them. Not all 4 are compatible with one another. What I mean by that is it's not possible for all 4 to be true at the same time. So here are your 4 statements. The body's a physical thing. The mind's a non-physical thing. The mind and the body interact and causally affect one another. Non-physical things cannot causally interact with physical things. So now if you pause the video here and look at these 4 statements, you can kind of play around a little bit and you can start to see that, oh yeah, it's not possible for all 4 of these things to be true at the same time. Now we got to keep in mind we're defining mind in a very particular way. We're defining mind as that kind of what you might experience as the essence of yourself, your consciousness. We're not talking about your brain. We're talking about this aspect of yourself, at least in this context. If the mind is a non-physical thing, then the mind is this sort of collection of ideas that make you. It's not just your brain synapses firing. Now, the reason that we call this the mind-body problem is because folks are oftentimes uncomfortable with the idea that they are simply meat. right? So if you exist only as a physical thing, then what that means is you don't have any essence of self that's not a product of your body. And probably most distressing, you don't have free will. Because after all, if you exist only as a physical thing, then you're subject to the physical laws of the universe, just like every other physical thing that exists. And one of the physical laws of the universe says all things that occur are things that were caused to occur by something that occurred the moment before. So you can think about that as it relates to things like trees falling or cars running into each other. And now we'd want to think about it in terms of the decisions that you make. I like to think that the decisions I make are decisions that I've chosen to make, that I could have done something else and I chose not to. And it really feels that way. And we'll look more at this in a few weeks. But for now, what we have to get clear is that if you believe only physical things that exist, then free will couldn't exist. Because if free will existed, that would mean that there was something that wasn't subject to the physical laws of the universe. So if you're just a meat machine, the decisions you make, they might feel like you're actually making them, but they're being caused by the events they're being caused by your brain state the moment before that decision occurs. So it's not even like you're really making the decision. It's sort of like the decision is being made and it occurs and it feels like you made it, but you really didn't. It was the inevitable decision that you had to have made given the way that things were in your body, in your brain at the moment you made that decision. So this makes folks uncomfortable. It also makes folks uncomfortable because they don't like thinking of themselves as not really all that much different from everything else that exists. We're just these, like I say, meat machines, meat puppets. So take a look at these statements and you'll see that statement number 2 is a statement you can understand a lot of people wanting to believe. But wanting to believe it is not good enough for philosophers. We don't want to have to take that leap. We don't want to just kind of fulfill our desires and delude ourselves into believing that something is true. We want to have really good reasons for believing it's true. We want to have a rationale for why we draw the conclusions that we do. So when we say, I think the mind is a non-physical thing that actually exists in reality, we better be prepared to explain why. All right, so that's what I'm going to show you right now here. I'm going to give you 2 arguments. They're both valid. And what I mean by that is that they're structured in such a way that if the statements leading up to the conclusion actually turn out to be true, the conclusion will also have to be true. There'll be no way for it to be false. And I'm going to give you another argument that's also a valid argument that's going to lead to a different conclusion. Okay, so the question for us is, which of these 2 arguments do I think is the better argument? Which one do I think has true premises? Okay, so here's the first argument. Premise number 1. If human beings possess a non-material self or soul, then human beings will experience themselves as more than just a material being of flesh, blood, bone, and electrochemical events. Premise number 2. Human beings do not experience themselves as more than just a material being of flesh, blood, bone, and electrochemical events. Therefore, human beings do not possess a non-material self or soul. Wah, wah. All right. If after studying this argument and really considering these premises carefully, you come to the conclusion that both premise number 1 is true and premise number 2 is true, you will have no choice but to accept the conclusion as also true, unless you want to live in a moment of irrationality, okay? Because this is what we would call a modus tollens. The way that this argument is structured guarantees this conclusion will be 100% true if we conclude that the 2 premises are true. But I'm going to give you another argument. Same first premise. If human beings experience themselves as more than just a material being of flesh, blood, bone, and electrochemical events, then human beings possess a non-material self or soul. Human beings experience themselves as more than just a material being of flesh, blood, bone, and electrochemical events. Therefore, human beings possess a non-material soul. All right, I guess those premises for two premises are kind of contrapositions of one another, or conversions of one another. All right, so what you have to do is you have to think really carefully. Which of these 2 arguments do you accept? You're going to have to reject one, because they both can't be true. They lead to different conclusions, and they lead to contradictory conclusions. So maybe screenshot this argument. We'll come back to it later, but maybe screenshot this argument or print it out for yourself and think about which one of these two arguments do you think is the better argument. And that's going to lead you to your conclusion on this metaphysical question of minds and bodies. All right, a thing that might help you evaluate this argument is to go back and reflect on one of the questionnaires you did in your thought primer, because you'll see that the pairs of questions that you answered, they're giving an indication of what you think about the nature of reality, right? The physical world is the only kind of reality there is versus the mind is something non-physical yet real. Were you consistent in your answers there? If not, you got some thinking to do. Number 3, mind is simply a word that refers to brain activity. Or 4, mind and brain interact and are different entities. Were you consistent in your answers there? If not, you got some thinking to do. Physical brain events are immediate cause of decisions. Or making a decision is not a physical event and does not have a physical cause. Only physical events can cause other physical events. Or an act of my will is not a physical event, but it can cause my body to perform some physical action. And finally, someday science will be able to explain everything a person thinks and feels. Or the mind and its activities will never be completely explained by brain science. So if you take each one of these question pairs and you find any inconsistencies in your responses, that's a place for you to really focus your thinking. Because what you're looking for is to be consistent. You're going to answer one question, yes, this is true, then by necessity, the next one would have to be false. And reverse. If you answer the first question false, then by necessity, the second question would have to be true. And if you're finding inconsistencies there, that indicates that you haven't yet entirely worked out this whole monism, dualism thing for yourself, and you'll want to keep poking and prodding so that you can come to some conclusions that you think are reasonable.